It's absolutely great to be here. I was struck, as Emer said, she didn't have a role model, which I fully forgive you for, Emer, as I sit beside you. But that my role model, now a matter of public record, Mary Robinson, Ireland's first female president, and of course she famously said that the hand that rocks the cradle rocked the system when she was elected. And I have always personally taken that as a sort of a marching order, completely convinced that I can be, as we all in this room want to be, fully fledged non-men, as I like to see us, but at the same time, at all times, ready to rock the system. And I think LEAP is a pure example of how we can help to accelerate those of us who know that rocking the system alone doesn't always get the results we're looking for. I think it's a fantastic initiative, delighted the government is supporting it, and certainly that you will not just be accelerated in your career development, but that you'll get to where you ought to be, which is at the helm. And I know that why that sense of leadership, participation and ownership is at the heart of everything you're doing. So thank you for being with me. I was asked if I'd say a couple of words about what I'm at. Maura gave a very perhaps ambitious sense of my trying to assist leadership on a global scale. My life is not as glamorous as this room suggests. Certainly the image of diplomats is belied when you do the job I'm currently doing, which is ambassador to the United Nations. I'm one of 40 women at the UN, but that doesn't sound so impressive when you realize there are 193 countries in the UN, and so 193 ambassadors. So we're just a group of 40 women in that wider pool. It means that our participation as women on a daily basis, and I would say our leadership in the UN work is actually, on the one hand, more important, I would argue, but also, a little bit more visible, which sometimes, frankly, and I say this very lightly, you should all remember that because you're not necessarily in the majority, that can actually sometimes be a helpful fact. But of course, I come from a generation, I'm looking around the room, older than most of you in the room. I went to university in 1977, and at that time, we were just 4 years out from the year that the marriage bar in Ireland was lifted. So in other words, the entitlement to continue working after you married, which seems like an incredibly basic idea to many of you in the room now, but in Ireland until 1973, when we joined the European Union, you had to retire as a woman. So I went straight from university into the Foreign Service. So in 1981, I joined the Foreign Service, and at that point, we had one serving female ambassador, largely due to that marriage bar. So the pipeline of women, the women you could look to in the department at that stage, was extremely limited. So if you can't be it, if you can't see it, you can't be it, was really a very vague concept to us starting out in the Foreign Service at that stage. I think we've made huge leaps and bounds in the Irish public service now, and I would argue, as an ex-ambassador at the European Union, that the European Union played a huge role there in revolutionising our social policy. We took to it like ducks to water, but nonetheless we needed the push. Another little thought as you go along in your career to make sure that the regulatory environment you're working in, whether it's within your business or in the wider context you're in, that they are conducive to you actually getting ahead. You know, brilliance and talent simply don't work if the culture and the environment don't support what you're trying to do. So now I'm happily part of a generation with Emer of women diplomats who are in the ascendancy in our system. And as I do my day-to-day job at the UN, I have to say I am personally as well as professionally constantly struck by how actually historically remarkable it is that I'm in that building as a woman, because for thousands of years, I'm sitting at tables now, for thousands of years women were not welcome, were not invited other than perhaps to serve at table. If I sit as I do, we're candidates for the Security Council, but I occasionally get to speak. at the Security Council as the Irish ambassador, and I think back to, you know, major decisions made there since the Second World War, where women's voices simply weren't heard. And so it is, on the one hand, an extraordinary opportunity, and hopefully when Ireland is elected to the Council, I'll be speaking for Ireland, which I think for Ireland in 2021, at 100 years of our independence, will be a very important moment. On the other hand, I'm very conscious also of the women who have gone before who never got to sit at those tables. So I almost take it as a sacred duty to make sure my voice is heard. So something that I want to come back to at the very end to say to you is that never miss an opportunity to use your voice. We have fought for a very long time. Maura referred, and another lady I met earlier on in the evening happened to be at the launch of Evan Boland's poem to mark 100 years of Irish suffragism in the UN. We launched it in the UN. Evan, I think, Ireland's preeminent living poet. Her dad was the president of the General Assembly, so there was a great poetry to launching her poem, which we commissioned for that event. Her byline in that poem was, "Our future will become the past of other women." And it's something, again, that no matter how hard the struggle has been, and I must say, if you ask me, 100 years later, we haven't actually arrived at a point where we can say in any way mission accomplished. We've made huge strides, but you know, it's been 100 years a long time if you consider the changes we've seen in the last 10 years. So I think the reminder that every step we take is forging the way for the women who are coming behind us. Again, a bit of a duty that I privately carry with me every day. We also, last week, and Maura, you spoke to me about that at the UN, launched something we call Blazing a Trail. It's in advance of the Commission on the Status of Women, which I'll say a word about now. But Blazing a Trail is telling the second part of an untold story about Irish women in the diaspora. The Irish diaspora, of course, famously 70 million of us off the island, shaping society, shaping, I would argue, the country we're living in now here, but also from Latin America through to Africa, playing extraordinary roles. I have never personally seen anywhere a reference to a standout female diaspora member. So in many ways, we've consistently told our diaspora story only in terms of the men who delivered. And there at the UN, in the main entrance, where 193 representatives and their teams come through, thousands of people a day, we have these stories of these Irish women. And I just have a couple of names. One, Mary Agnes Lee of Monaghan, who left Monaghan, rural Monaghan, in the mid-19th century, headed out to the outback in Australia and single-handedly delivered the vote for women in southern Australia. I had never heard of Mary Agnes Lee before. Mary Heath, an aviator, she was a dispatch rider in pre-war France, went off then to fly around East Africa doing humanitarian work. Again, a name deserves to be repeated, Mary Heath, never heard of her. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who actually in the 20th century here became a major trade union leader in the United States. You know her. And very influential, also became remarkably the first female leader of the American Communist Party. So she may not have been as popular as some other female politicians, but it just goes to show you that women out there, unsung heroines of our own very recent history, that we haven't allowed a voice to be heard. So, you know, I think it's great that now we are finding the opportunity to underline that the story of Irish women on and off the island is ripe to be told. I'll say a couple of words just about the two big projects in terms of women and global leadership that I'm involved with at the UN at the moment. The Commission on the Status of Women is, Maura described it as the second biggest event in the UN. There will be 9,000 additional delegates come to the Commission on the Status of Women in the middle of March. I chair the Commission on the Status of Women this time for the second and last year. It's the only global body that deals with women's rights, and it's a norm setting. So it's a body that actually gets to set out the detail of women's rights, and women's rights, as Hillary Clinton famously said, women's rights are human rights. And so that body in a very complex and I will say very trying 2 weeks of negotiation, picks an area of particular vulnerability for women globally. And normally the issues we pick are ones that have a resonance both in the global north, so for every one of us in this room, but also in particular in the broader context of the challenges women in rooms that aren't as gracious as this in the global south deal with. Last year, we, for the first time ever, managed to get agreement on rural women and the range of issues, including entitlement to land ownership, their participation in legal and political process, which isn't a given actually, not just in the developing world, but in many northern capitals where you'd be actually quite surprised. Take France, Moët, my last post in Paris, women's legal entitlements to property ownership in France isn't actually as liberal as you might think Monsieur Macron would believe. In fact, it's Napoleonic. And some issues like that, the light is shone on them, and there's an agreed outcome, so governments are bound. They're not legally bound, but they're certainly politically bound, and there's a real moral imperative from the Commission on the Status of Women to advance women's rights in those areas. This year, our topic is one that comes very close to home, and I think for every woman in this room, it will be focusing on social protection. Social protection in terms of access to social services, in terms of access to social infrastructure. So it's also everything to do with your entitlement to pensions, to equal pay, the entitlement of young women in developing countries to sanitation facilities at schools, because we know statistically that at the age of 13 or 14 girls fall off from schools because there aren't proper sanitation facilities for them. It's a question of lights on roads. Infrastructure sounds sophisticated when we stand here in New York. It's actually a question of lights being lit to allow girls to go safely home from school. So we are dealing with a huge range of issues, but I have to say the thorny heart of our debate this year will be, again, a debate around human rights in terms of sexual and reproductive health and sexual education. And now, in the past, of course, when we began those negotiations, someone in my role, there hasn't been a woman doing this for a long time, so I'm told my predecessors always felt that they had the North and the North American vote to depend on in pushing through results. Unfortunately, that is not the case now. So suddenly the world became for sexual reproductive health, women's rights in that broader domain, extremely difficult and complex, and so we will face into that this year again, but with every determination to get an outcome. The second area I'll mention that's particularly important to me because I think it reflects very much our own lived experience in Ireland is the role of women in peace building and peacemaking in that wider security and peace building agenda that's really at the heart of what the UN thinks it's about, not always about that. But Mary Robinson, again, not the only one, but has made the point that you simply can't have a sustainable peace in a society where half of the society is left outside the table of the negotiation. And in the just 18 months I've been at the UN, there is a path beaten to my door by women from Yemen, from Syria, from Colombia, from Burundi, all of whom are in conflict situations, trying to understand how the voice of women was knitted so powerfully into our Good Friday Agreement 21 years ago now. And at that time, there is a famous Security Council resolution known as 1325, which sets out some of the norms for including women in peace building. That didn't exist 21 years ago. You had, over a dinner table conversation in Northern Ireland, a group of women who realized that there was a moment in history erupting around them, really, and they couldn't get to the table because they didn't have an electoral platform. And so in 6 weeks, they pulled together a small group of women activists, grassroots activists in the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and got themselves 2 elected representatives, which gave them a ticket to the table. They were, as they say, mooed and booed at the table. They were certainly not welcomed to the table, but now looking back to their contribution to to that agreement, it was fundamental and critical to the sustainability of that agreement. I mean, they were single-handedly, women at the table, responsible for including language on victims, on reconciliation, on integration of schooling, on mixed housing, the sort of issues that we would all say, well, they're, you know, you think they're fundamental, but in fact, at the table, traditionally, peace agreements looked more at male-dominated structures, if I can put it in those terms, in terms of the peace arrangements, about decommissioning of weapons, about what we would call the harder end of peace. Whereas in fact, what keeps peace alive and durable is if it's community-based, and if people who are living, who are crossing the road with their children to school know the safe areas to do that in, and can have the support of existing peace agreements. So that's another priority for Ireland, actually, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, born of our own direct experience, and it's always a matter of great pride to me as I speak at the UN. So, I mean, they're just two sort of the very broad areas that, in terms of female global leadership, make a difference at the UN. But if I were to come back to the end of the beginning of the end of the story, it really is that none of that would be possible in terms of aspiration or achievement if women don't find their voice. I think that we have made enormous progress in terms of, you know, women being sort of more successful in being recruited into companies, women rising in the diplomatic service, more women, not enough, at the table at the UN. So we know that we have our voice, but frankly, we also have an obligation to raise it. And I, as a matter of principle, gather women around me in order to ensure simple things in a meeting that I will always pick up, even if it's not a point that I would particularly have wanted to make in the past. I will always pick up a point made by another woman, so the echo of a woman's voice is heard. I believe there is a value in that. I don't think it's tokenism. I think that there is a question of hearing a perspective and a voice that hasn't been heard for a very long time. Women's silence across the globe has cost us a lot over very long periods, and now that we have the microphone, I don't believe we should put it down. So thank you.